you want to ask any questions. At 7:05, we're going to have the director and the chief of staff for the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. The primary topic of conversation will be unemployment fraud and how these unemployment debit cards work. But if you have a question about the Colorado unemployment system, and let's try to avoid very narrow issues that only apply to one person. If you have a question that you think is something multiple people might be dealing with or multiple businesses might be dealing with, send it over to me by email at ross@khow.com or by text at 57739, and I will get at least some listener questions into the conversation. Again, that's going to be 7:05 with Joe Barella and Daniel Chase from the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. Let's see, 8:05, CJ Box, one of the great modern thriller writers, and he's got this very unique niche because CJ lives in Wyoming and writes about Wyoming, and it just makes these fantastic settings that I think Coloradans better than most people can relate to, and just a whole different kind of setting from most thrillers, which take place in cities, or spy novels, which might be in various interesting places around the world. But it's kind of cool to see a place in the Western wilderness, stories set in the Western wilderness. So, all right, so that's what's coming up as far as guests today. I want to just follow up with you on a couple of quick things, or not so quick maybe. A few years ago, gosh, 3-4 years ago at this point, we got solar panels on our previous house in Littleton. And I mentioned on the air that the only reason I got the solar panels was because the tax credits lowered the price enough that I could tolerate the break-even period. I want to say the break-even for me was about 7 years. I didn't end up living in that house for even half of that 7 years from the time that I bought the solar panels, and ended up losing money for sure, because I don't think I really got that money back when I sold the place. In other words, I think I could have sold the place for as much as I sold it for, even if it didn't have the solar panels. But anyway, I mentioned that I got it because I bought them because the solar panel subsidy made the math good enough. Not great, but good enough. And then yesterday on the show, I talked a little bit about how Kristen's fantastic new vehicle, which we got at BMW of Loveland, John Elway's newest dealership, is a hybrid. And I was talking a little bit about the math of hybrid savings and all that. And, a lot depends obviously on the price of gas versus the price of electricity and that sort of stuff. And then, I mentioned, and a few people have asked me, hey, Ross, why did you get the hybrid? And I said, first of all, it is more efficient. It is definitely more, it's definitely at least a small cost savings, and it also saves trips to the gas station, which I like. But the main thing was that combining the federal and state subsidies, which together I believe will come to $10,000, it puts the price of the hybrid at or slightly below the price of the non-hybrid. And I believe the hybrid is worth more. I believe if I were to sell it as a used vehicle, I could sell it for more than the non-hybrid, just as an example. And I do like it better. I like having the hybrid, right? It's not going to save the world, but it's a modest improvement for us over the non-hybrid for reasons that I already talked about. And I said I probably wouldn't have gotten it without the tax credits. And every time this kind of topic comes up, I get some listener emails saying things like, Ross, you're no better than any other leftist or social engineer who's trying to use the tax code to force us to behave in a certain way. And I've said on the air, I've said, I don't apologize for taking these tax credits. I'll work with you every step of the way to try to prevent the legislature, federal or state, from passing any tax credit like that, any subsidy like that ever, whether or not I think I'll ever use it. I will be with you trying to prevent it from passing. Always. I'm against all this stuff. Does that mean I'm not supposed to take the tax credit once it passes? And just for fun, you know, there are not very many people in this world that I look to for, you know, ongoing guidance, mentorship. In politics, you've heard my friend Tom Krannawitter on the show a lot. He's one who I consider really a mentor, just a brilliant guy and a great educator as well. I mean, he used to be a professor. And in the sphere of economics, one person who I really consider a mentor is Don Boudreaux, George Mason University, also a professor, former chairman of the department there, and the most libertarian person I know. Don Boudreaux is far more libertarian than I am. I was emailing with Don yesterday, and he said he opposes public roads. He thinks all roads and highways should be private. Just to give you an example of where Don is, of course, he opposes every kind of tax subsidy and special narrow tax credits and all that. So he's as libertarian as you're going to get. And I sent him a question. And in fact, I should do my best here to make sure that I get the question exactly right, if I can find it in my emails, because I thought it was really important. Let me just find this real quick. Okay. So I was asking him this question that listeners were basically asking me or accusing me of violating my own principles. Here's what I asked Don. Is it unethical for a person who opposes the legislature's enacting a particular tax credit, taking that tax credit once it's enacted? And I think I put the question neutrally, right? I didn't word the question in a way that has bias toward one answer or the other. And I'm pretty confident in my answer that the people who are criticizing me for taking the tax credit are wrong, but I actually think it's a very interesting ethical question. And Don sent back to me, he said, even a person who is opposed to and expresses that opposition to a rule is entitled to play by that rule if others choose to impose it. He also noted that Jim Buchanan, very famous economist, and Dwight Lee wrote an excellent paper on this topic, and I asked him if he could try to find that for me, and he said he will. Now, he brought up a couple of interesting points that I want to share with you. And partly this conversation is about economics, but partly it's about ethics and philosophy, which is stuff that I just love, even at 6:15 in the morning. First of all, let's say I went over to somebody's house to play Hold'em poker. And the plan was to play Hold'em poker, but we get there, you know, and there's like 12 people there to play poker, and they decide as a group that we're not going to play Hold'em poker, we're going to play 5-card draw instead. And so then I sit down and I play 5-card draw, and it turns out maybe I even win some money, although that part isn't particularly appropriate to the story, or what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a requirement of the story, but I like the idea that maybe I won a little money at poker. Have I committed some kind of ethical failing by taking their money at a game that they decided I should play, even though I wanted to play a different game? No. And if you don't like that analogy, let's try this one on. All of these tax credits and tax subsidies are paid for by redistribution of taxes from other people. If it's a state where they run a balanced budget every year, the state's tax credit for electric and hybrid vehicles, then the cost of that subsidy is being directly paid that year by taxpayers to everybody who got, in this case, an electric vehicle tax credit. And I would point out, electric vehicle tax credits tend to go to upper middle class people. They tend to go to people like me. Makes it seem kind of odd when you think about it that way. But so that money, that tax credit is immediately being paid for by somebody else. And then at the federal level, since we're running a deficit, the tax credit is to some percentage being paid by current taxpayers and some percentage being paid by future taxpayers, like your children and mine. So here's the question. If you would have me refuse to take a tax credit that was duly passed by the legislature because you think that as a libertarian who opposes these tax credits that I shouldn't take them even if they're offered, do you think it would be okay either, and when I say do you think it would be okay, what I mean that in two separate ways. Do you think the government would say it's okay? That's one question. And the second question is, would you personally say it's okay? If, and I realize the numbers we're talking about here are very small, but if on a theoretical basis at least, I was allowed to refuse to pay my proportionate share of current and future taxes required to cover the cost of these subsidies. What do you think about that as a concept? Do you think the government would ever allow that? Would you ever allow that if you were in charge? In other words, would you ever allow an American citizen or citizen of your state as well, because there are state subsidies, to say, if you refuse to take this subsidy and sign a piece of paper saying you can never take it and will never take it, and I don't care what it's for, we can stick with electric vehicles or solar panels or whatever you like, then you will give me permission to figure out what percentage of my tax bill is represented by that amount, and you will give everybody permission to do the same thing, not just me, and we can all say, these subsidies represent X percent of our taxes, and we are not going to pay that X percent of our taxes to pay for these subsidies, and we won't ever take the subsidies. You think that would be okay? You know the answer. I don't know whether those of you out there who hate the subsidies as much as I do and are emailing me, telling me that I shouldn't have taken it, shouldn't take the tax credit, I don't know whether you would go along with that. There's no way the government would. You know that, and I know that. Is that Tom Brady, Shannon? Tom Brady's razor, don't hate the player, hate the game. I love that applause. I just love that. So I asked my most libertarian, most tax credit, tax subsidy hating friend, is it unethical for me to take a tax credit that I oppose once it's passed into law? He said, absolutely not. If you are forced to pay your share of it, you absolutely should take it if you can. And that's where I've been all along, but, you know, I kind of confirmed if there was anybody who was ever going to say, no, don't take, let me put it this way. If there was anybody whose opinion I respect who was ever going to say, don't take the tax subsidy, it would be Don Boudreaux. And when I say whose opinion I respect, it doesn't mean I don't respect my listener's opinion. What I mean is Don Boudreau has spent a career, decades, thinking about these kinds of issues. And I think lots of other people, will react after thinking about it for 1 minute. And so I really care a lot about what Don had to say. And I think it's right. I think if you want to make an argument that I shouldn't take a tax credit that's offered, or that you shouldn't, that anybody shouldn't, you should be prepared to make the argument that we should also not have to pay for it. Some people have suggested that, well, Ross, by taking a tax credit, you are encouraging the government to implement more tax credits. I don't know whether that's true or not. All I can tell you is that without fail, I support politicians who I expect will oppose almost every tax credit, right? Every once in a while, someone lets you down. I'll give you one example. One of my very, very favorite members of the Senate, maybe my single favorite member of the Senate, is Mike Lee of Utah. Need to get him back on the show. It's been a long time. And Mike Lee, along with Mitt Romney, those two are both Mormons, and that does play into this, what I'm about to say, on a policy basis. And Marco Rubio, who's a Catholic, which also fits in on a policy basis, are supporting much larger tax credits and subsidies for people having children. I oppose that. Every once in a while, they let you down. But most of the time, I support politicians who I know will be steadfastly against any and every tax credit and subsidy, even one that I believe I would take if it were implemented. And let me just end this topic with this statement. I promise you that every time there is an opportunity for me legally to recover some of what I pay in taxes through taking a tax credit, a subsidy, or a deduction, I will do it 100% of the time, and I encourage you to do the same. When we come back, an unbelievably aggressive and annoying response by Tay Anderson.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW, Denver.